In the following 1737th year, the campaign in the Crimea was repeated, but without Minsk. It was decided to strike two blows in two different directions, at the Turkish fortress of Ochakiv and in the Crimea. Minsk went to Ochakiv from the 90,000th Army and took the fortress. Field Marshal Lacy entered the Crimea, 40,000 regular army and 15,000 Cossacks. He made an original, albeit risky move. The Crimean Khan did not expect the invasion of the Russians, except through Perekop, where he stood up with an army of 60,000. But the Lacy took a detour. Along the Arabat Spit or Arabat Arrow, strips of land 103 versts long and up to 5 versts wide, stretching along the eastern coast of Crimea. Then, having built bridges, he entered the Crimea, gave several successful battles for the Russians, and made, as the military encyclopedia delicately puts it, great devastation. The authorities, having sensitively battered the Tatars in the battles and pretty much ruined everything they could, considered their task accomplished and retreated the same way. In the following 1738th year, he returned there last year, by passing, however, by another route, taking advantage of the west wind that stole water from the Sivash Strait, crossed it, as the Red Army under the command of Franz subsequently did. Again successful for the Russian battles, everything that can be set on fire burns again, and the old troubles are announced again. Lack of food and water, diseases. Menek, meanwhile, distracted the Turks with a blow to Moldova, where he fairly crushed the Janissaries in an open field near Stavachny. This time, along with the land army, the Russian navy under the command of Vice Admiral Bredel also acted. The fleet, it should be clarified right away, consisted not of warships, but of 217 large boats, in the manner of Zaporozhye or Don, armed with small-caliber falconets. In addition, after a sudden storm, there were only 47 boats left, and a Turkish fleet of 2 battleships, a frigate and 85 war galleys was approaching from the sea. However, in such unequal conditions, Bredel managed to win. He arranged the remaining boats in 2 lines in a staggered order, at a depth of less than 2 meters, so that the Turkish real ships, formidable on high water, with their deep draft, simply could not approach the boats close enough. Bredel also placed coastal batteries on land. It seems incredible now, but Bredel won a real ringing victory. The artillery duel lasted about an hour, after which the Turks left the battlefield. Their losses remained unknown, but Bredel did not have a single killed or wounded. In the end, the Lacy retreated through Perekop, blowing up and completely destroying the fortifications there. Bredel burned his boats so as not to leave them to the Turks, and retreated by another road. His battle with the Turkish squadron remained the first and only Russian-Turkish naval battle on the Sea of Azov. As unsuccessful as all 3 Crimean campaigns of Anna Ioanovna's time were for Russians, they still remained raids, albeit very large scale. It became clear again that the time had not come to take Crimea. However, all the devastation has played a role. Crimean Tatars and Nogai people sharply reduced the number of raids on the Russian southern borders. The most recent one, however, took place already under Catherine in 1769th year, but as a pale shadow of the former ones. The projects of the complete conquest of the Crimea were postponed for 33 years. A few years after Catherine's accession, Russia, taking advantage of the flowery turnover widely spread among Persian scribes, rolled up the carpet of her passion and put it in the chest of expectation. However, the wait didn't last too long. In 1768th year, Turkey declared another war on Russia, and Khan Karamjere, according to his vassal duty, moved with 100,000 troops to Bessarabia, where he died unexpectedly, which did not cause the Tatars the slightest confusion. The procedure in this regard has been worked out for a long time. Every time they chose a new Khan, according to the traditions of the bizarre and peculiar democracy there, the noble Murzes also chose an official heir, called Kalga Khan. The Khan's own son did not always become a Kolgu. The Giri family was numerous, and there was a solid personnel reserve. So, as a matter of fact, in which case there were not even elections, but simply the approval of Kalga as Khan. Except that I had to choose a new Kalga. In full accordance with tradition, the Murzes quickly approved Devlet Gire, a good military commander, as the new Khan. Devlet died in that war. Selimjeri became the Khan, a completely colorless and untalented person in all respects. In such difficult times, when Turkey was weakening and Russia was getting stronger, the Khanate needed a strong personality on the throne. But what can we do if, observing the Crimean democracy, the Murzes chose Selim? A fat polar fox appeared on the Crimean borders, grinning cynically. Russian troops have already occupied most of the former wild field of the northern Black Sea region, which was called Novorossiya, and began to develop. The hordes of Tatars who roamed there, known as the Edisons, Bujeks and Jambuluk, either declared themselves supporters of Russia, or undertook to maintain neutrality in the event of a military conflict between Russia and the Crimea. A kind of peculiar maiden. The point, of course, was not in pro-Russian sympathies. Russian agents simply handed over decent sums of gold to the leaders of the mentioned hordes, and they, like honest people, worked out the money. The lid of the waiting chest came up with a bang. 38,000th Russian Corps, under the command of Prince Dolgorukov, moved to Perekop. In Crimean affairs, he is by no means a novice. In 1736th year, while still a dragoon corporal, he participated in the campaign of Minich. For bravery in the capture of the Perekop fortifications, he was promoted to ensign. By the way, the newly made ensign was only 14 years old, but this happened more than once in Russia and in Europe in that century. If the guy was tall and strong, he got into the army at such a young age, in our opinion. Now Dolgorukov was returning with the rather high rank of an Anch general, which in the current Russian army corresponds to the rank of army general. Contemporaries considered Dolgorukov a very brave general, but they differed in their assessment of his military talents. Others called him unskillful, or even the most incapable, which was completely unfair. The authors of the military encyclopedia believe that, undoubtedly, Dolgorukov did not belong to the number of outstanding generals, but he always carried out the task entrusted to him, intelligently, with diligence and success. That's exactly what happened this time. After an assault lasting a little more than a day, Dolgorukov took the Perekop fortifications. Although they were defended by superior forces, 50,000 Tatars and 7,000 Turks. A few days later, another part of Dolgorukov's army crossed the Sivish, covered from the sea by the squadron of the future famous General Sinyavin, and immediately occupied the Arabat fortress. Dolgorukov resolutely moved deep into the Crimea. Selimjeri, immediately after the defeat at Perekop, fled to Istanbul, shifting the defense of the Crimea to the commander of the Turkish troops in the Crimea. Ibrahim went. Then, although he had forces several times superior to Dolgorukov's corps, he quickly retreated to the Cafe. Dolgorukov, who pursued him, won an even more glorious victory at Kaffa than at Perekop. With only 27,000 troops, he smashed 95,000 Tatar Turkish troops to pieces near Kaffa. So much for not being able. After that, the Russians began firing cannons not only at the Kaffa fortification, but also at the Turkish military squadron anchored there, which very quickly took off from the anchors and sailed to Turkey. After a short, fierce assault, Dolgorukov took Kaffa, as they said at the time, to the sword. The Turkish commandant surrendered. As a matter of fact, the military operations ended with the capture of Kaffa. Every single Turkish soldier who still remained in Kirk hastily boarded the ships and sailed home, rightly judging that the game was over with a crushing score not in their favor. The cities on the eastern coast of Crimea, Kirk, Yenikali, Geslov, Yevpatoria, Balaklava surrendered without resistance. And so, it was inconsistent on the part of the Crimean Tatars. For about a month, Dolgorukov conducted a lively correspondence with notable Murza electors. And somehow it turned out that Saib Gire too was elected the new Khan, whose envoys offered Russia eternal friendship and an indissoluble alliance in the person of Dolgorukov, solemnly declaring that Crimea no longer considers itself a vassal of Turkey, but wants to go under the patronage of the Empress. This was not only a military victory. Dolgorukov demanded the immediate release of all slaves, not only Russians, but all Christians in general. Tatar Murzes and mullahs bought 1,200 prisoners from the owners for their own money. But about 9,000 more, having heard about what was happening, did not wait for the ransom, but simply fled to the location of the Russian army. Many Russian soldiers, mostly who lived on the southern borders of Russia before conscription, found among them children who had once been stolen in full. Not limiting himself to the release of prisoners, Dolgorukov ordered to reinstall crosses on 12 Greek churches and cafes, and hang bells there. And then, he ordered the restoration of Orthodox churches wherever they once were. There were still many Christians living in Crimea, not prisoners, but free. He resolutely ignored the dissatisfaction of the Tatars. In the end, Dolgorukov withdrew most of the troops from the Crimea. Military force was necessary in the long war with the Turks, but he left garrisons in several fortresses for control. For this campaign, the Empress awarded Dolgorukov with the Order of St. George of the First Degree, 6 to 10,000 rubles, and a gold snuffbox with her portrait, which at that time was also considered a high award. 4 years later, Dolgorukov received a golden sword with diamonds for the Order of St. Andrew, as well as for the first time in Russian history, an honorary addition to the surname. From now on, he was officially called Dolgorukov Crimean in all documents. However, Dolgorukov himself counted on the field marshal's baton and, without receiving it, became offended and resigned. Then, however, he returned to work. The situation in Crimea has changed in the most decisive way. As it is easy to guess, Turkey still considered the Crimean Khanate to be its vassal. But, no matter what they thought in Istanbul, there was not a single Turk in Crimea anymore. But there were Russian garrisons, and the pro-Russian party, well paid for in gold, was in full swing. A little later, when the next Russian-Turkish war ended, and peace was concluded, according to the peace treaty known as the Kuka-Kaynardzi Tract 1774th year, the Sultan officially legally recognized the complete independence of Crimea from Turkey. True, he remained the Caliph, the purely spiritual leader of the Crimean Muslims, and formally claimed the throne of the next Khan, but in fact, he could no longer influence the Crimean events. In Crimea, coins were still minted with the bright face of the Sultan, or rather, just the Caliph, but the independence of the Crimea led to the fact that everything else was only a matter of time. The last Crimean Khan was Shagin-Giray. Interestingly, he received his education in Venice and was seriously engaged in versification. After he, while still a Kolga, visited St. Petersburg in 1771st year, Catherine wrote to Voltaire, not without a hidden irony, a gentle nature, he writes Arabic poems. It follows that Kalga also knew Arabic. Despite his European education and poetic predilections, Shagin-Giray, who became Khan in 1777th year, remained an extremely cruel despot by nature. However, in diplomacy and military affairs, he turned out to be a complete incompetence, which is extremely fraught for any ruler, especially in the position of Khan, with the saddest consequences. You can't last long on one stupid cruelty. Shagin did not last. He became Khan in April 1777th year, and at the end of the year, the Turkish party raised a rebellion in the Crimea. A Turkish squadron sailed to the aid of the mutinous Murzes and brought one of the former Khans to replace Shagin, who was reminded of European education and much more, according to the rebels and Turks, incompatible with the moral image of a true Muslim. And Shagin was publicly declared an infidel for sleeping on a bed, sitting on chairs, and not praying like a Muslim. Shagin fled from Crimea to the Russians, asking for help in the most pitiful way. It was immediately provided. Russian troops quickly suppressed the opposition with the most non-delicate methods. The Turkish squadron sailed home. Shagin-Giray brutally dealt with his enemies and, according to Prince Potemkin, imagined himself to be the Crimean Peter the Great. Well, what can I do? Shagin has never been distinguished by a special mind. What the events that followed soon vividly demonstrated. It just so happened that trade and a significant part of the agriculture of the Khanate rested on the Free Orthodox. Greeks, Georgians and Armenians. By that time, the Russians had settled 1,200 Greeks in the Yenikali they occupied. The Tatars, incited by the mullahs and Polish supporters of the Khan of the latter, there were a lot of them in the Crimea by that time. Even the Khan's army, which had become mostly mercenary, was commanded by a Polish nobleman, undertook to oppress all Orthodox in every possible way, completely without thinking about the consequences. And the consequences were not long in coming, and turned out to be the saddest for the Tatars. Russia simply organized the withdrawal of all Orthodox Christians from Crimea without exception. 31,098 people. After that, Crimea was left without trade and without agriculture overnight. An old ancestral craft. It was now absolutely impossible to engage in raids on neighbors, robberies, and the capture of prisoners. In the summer of 1782, the Turkish party staged a new rebellion in the Crimea, with the only difference that their candidate for the throne was not imported from Turkey, but, so to speak, homegrown. One of Shagin's own brothers, Batyr Gire, who, spitting on family ties, agreed to become Khan. There was nothing specifically Oriental about it. From time immemorial, both in Europe and in Russia, brothers, then husband and wife, then father and sons, fought to the death. In the battle for the throne, Shagin Gire ran to Novorossiya with a well-trodden path, and again begged the Russians to return the throne to him, promising to become incredibly obedient. In present-day Berdyansk, then Petrovsk, he met Potemkin, who rushed from the Baltic Sea in just 16 days. Only couriers were running at that speed back then. Shagin was certainly not to his taste, but there was simply nothing better in the household. General de Balmain and his corps entered the Crimea, quickly suppressed the rebellion, killing 400 people, and Shagin again took the throne in the pretty dilapidated Second Bakhchisaray Palace, this time under the constant guard of Russian soldiers, which made him a perfect puppet. He didn't sit there for long. Potemkin firmly decided that it was time to finally put an end to the absurd relic of the past of the Tatarkans, and began to insist on the final annexation of the peninsula to Russia. Ekaterina was cautious, but Potemkin did not back down, persuading her to take a course on a hard line. He said that the Crimea breaks our borders with its position, and the Turks can freely enter through it, into our heart, so to speak. He reminded me that the moment was extremely appropriate. England by that time in St. Petersburg, it was already clear that this was the main and implacable enemy of Russia, however, preferring to act with someone else's hands, threw all her forces into the war with the French and the rebellious American colonies. Austria, one of the main European players, will not protest, and Turkey has not yet recovered from the riots there, and the plague epidemic. Put it now, that the Crimea is yours, and that there is no longer this wart on your nose. Potemkin exclaimed, "Most gracious madam, you are obliged to raise the glory of Russia. Look who was challenged, who bought what. France took Corsica, the Caesars. Austrians. Without the war, the Turks in Moldova took more than we did. There is no power in Europe that does not divide Asia, Africa and America among themselves. Believe me, with the acquisition, you will receive immortal glory, and such as no sovereign in Russia has ever had. This glory will pave the way to another and greater glory. With Crimea comes the domination of the Black Sea. We need a paradise in Russia." Catherine was still hesitating, fearing that the annexation of the Crimea would lead to a new war, and believed that for now it was enough to occupy only the Aktyar harbor. Potemkin also insisted encouragingly that he had calculated everything correctly with regard to the situation of England. British Ambassador Harris assured him that England would not prevent the annexation of Crimea to Russia. She really didn't have the opportunity. All forces were thrown against the French and George Washington, so there was nothing to threaten, in fact. In the end, Catherine decided, and in December of 1782, she gave Potemkin a secret rescript on the annexation of the Crimea. However, with a number of reservations. If Shagingire was overthrown or died, if he did not want to give Russia the October harbor, if the Turks declared war, Potemkin was in a hurry. And first of all, it was necessary to prepare for a possible war with Turkey. Secondly, France and England began peace negotiations, signed a preliminary peace agreement, and there was only 6 months left before its ratification, so there was absolutely no time to wait for Shagingire, who was not yet old, even if he was ready to hand over the October harbor to Russia, to deign to die his own death. General de Balmain, who had a considerable number of Russian troops stationed in the Crimea, had a soft, sincere conversation with Shagingire, similar to the one that Grigory Orlov conducted with Hetman Razumovsky not so long ago. Shagingire understood perfectly well that he was in a perfect situation. In general, he was at a complete dead end, and therefore, for a lot of money, he agreed to abdicate. Well, the Russians took over all the further ones. However, having renounced and received his 200,000 in gold, Shagingire did not leave the Crimea as promised, but sat there, quietly encouraging Murzes not to trust Russia. However, the Murzes soberly assessed the situation. There is clearly no help from Istanbul, but there are a lot of Russian troops in the Crimea. Besides, in the pockets of many of them, as well as the Nogoikans, Russian gold was ringing pleasantly, and I wanted more. So, the Murzes made it clear to the former Khan in no uncertain terms, "Stop spoiling, it's time to get out of here, before some kind of accident happens." Shagin heeded and left. He died soon after, perhaps from chagrin. I was really too lazy to dig into it and clarify exactly where he gave his soul to Allah, and in what year. This, in fact, is not interesting. The main thing has happened. The power of the Girai, who ruled the Crimea for almost 300 years, has been stopped. The Murzes and the highest Muslim clergy of the former Crimean Khanate gathered and swore allegiance to the Empress on the Koran. Potemkin took the oath personally, first from the clergy, then from the Murzes. The same thing happened in the Kuban. There, in the steppe near Yeysk, the Nogai camp of 6,000 tents was spread out. The leaders of the Nogai solemnly read out the abdication of Shagingire, and they too, realists in big politics, swore an oath to Catherine. Suvorov, who was also no stranger to Crimean affairs, took the oath 7 years ago. In 1776th year, during the next Russian-Crimean friction, he beat Devlet-Gire in the Crimea. In Crimea, everything went much more modestly, but the Nogai people saw an opportunity to throw a luxurious holiday, which they arranged. 100 bulls and 800 sheep were slaughtered for kebabs and other dishes. The Nogai people competed with the Cossacks of Suvorov in horse racing, and then along with the Cossacks, they had fun drinking vodka. Yeah, that's right. Through vodka, Muslims have long ago found a great loophole that allowed them to consume alcohol, in spite of the strict prohibition of the Koran. The fact is that the Koran strictly forbids the faithful to drink the juice of fermented berries, that is, wine. When the Prophet Muhammad, out of respect, hallowed be his name, wrote the Quran. Neither in the Muslim world, nor in the Christian world, has anyone ever heard of alcohol or vodka. And vodka, as you know, is chased from grain, which of course, cannot be attributed to berries, and on a completely different principle than fermentation. Nothing is said about her in the Quran. At one time in Uzbekistan, I personally observed this cunning woman at feasts with the locals. Uzbeks and Tajiks did not take a drop of wine or brandy, which is again made from wine, into their mouths, but vodka was consumed with all diligence, spreading their hands with sly simplicity. The Holy Quran does not mention a word about the prohibition of Muslims to drink vodka. Potemkin wrote to Catherine, "Toridkerson, the source of our Christianity, and therefore of humanity, is already in the arms of its daughter. There is something mystical here. The Tatar clan was once a tyrant of Russia, and in recent times, a hundredfold ruiner, whose power was cut by Tsar Ivan Vasilievich. You destroyed the root. The borders of the present promised the peace of Russia, the envy of Europe, and the fear of the Ottoman Portia. Ascend to the trophy not enriched with blood, and order the historians to prepare more ink and paper." Blood was spilled after all. Just a month after the oath, the Nogai people massacred their pro-Russian Murzes. Some researchers see here the intrigues of Shagin Gire, who at that time illegally settled in Taman. However, Suvorov reacted quickly and soon defeated the best Nogai cavalry in the Kermanshik tract, after which the Nogai calmed down and no longer violated the oath. Most importantly, there was no war and serious diplomatic complications. The Russian envoy reported from Istanbul that the Turks would not argue about Crimea if they did not follow what new circumstances from Europe did not follow. England was completely absorbed in the peace treaty with the newborn United States. France and Prussia tried to organize some serious dirty trick, but the Austrian Emperor Joseph II unequivocally sided with Russia, who firmly declared Russia's support in the Crimean issue. As usual, it was not a matter of sympathy, but of pressing politics. Austria itself intended to cut off some lands from the Turks, and it was extremely tempting to use the history of the Crimea as a precedent. In general, Russia should have been friends against the Turks. Since Austria was a formidable force at that time, the French and Prussians quieted down. In April, Catherine's manifesto was published, the content of which is clear from the name, on the acceptance of the peninsula of the Crimean island of Taman and the entire Cuban side under the Russian power. In order to preserve the loyalty of the newly baked Crimean subjects, they were strictly ordered to be treated as gently as possible. Potemkin wrote to General de Balmain, "It is the will of Her Imperial Majesty that all the troops staying in the Crimean Peninsula treat the residents in a friendly manner, without causing any offense, which the chiefs and regimental commanders have to set an example of." After that, the Empress elevated all Tatar Mursi, without exception, to the Russian nobility. Shirokrat wrote, later, Russian historians of the 19th century quipped that in the first years after the annexation of the Crimea, the nobility was given to everyone who wore a saber on his side and shouted that he was a big man. It is quite possible that there was no need to be ironic here. Unlike the little Russian gentry with its fantasy pedigrees, all the Murzes were Genghisids, who at certain periods of Russian history stood even higher than the Rurikovich and Gediminovich. Then, so that impostors did not get into the number of Genghisids, the Khanate's heirs of the Golden Horde were strictly monitored. The infamously famous Mamai remained a prisoner of the Golden Horde all his life, that is, just a military commander. With all his ambition, he did not try to become a Khan, because he understood perfectly well he does not belong to the Genghisids, so no one will allow him to power. He had to look for real Genghisids, weak-willed ones, from whom you can see the ropes, and put them on the throne as your puppets, and manage yourself from behind the scenes. The graces and privileges were not limited to this. Many notable Tatars were appointed military and civilian officials. After the first noble elections in Crimea, the county leaders of the nobility, county judges, county police officers, deputies, assessors of the noble OPEC, members of the upper and lower Zemstvo courts, all became young Murzes with ranks. Widely, such a situation, when the majority of positions chosen from the nobility were occupied by Murzes, persisted until 1849th year. Russia, using modern terms, exercised only general leadership. The Tatars were also left with their own legal proceedings, where lawsuits were considered by clerics at the lemma, and the Muslim clergy themselves were forever exempt from any taxes. Recruitment kits were cancelled for Crimean Tatars, but volunteers who wanted to serve in the Russian army were enlisted without delay. Many Tatars and noble families later rose to the rank of generals. There are many such people known. Moreover, it should be emphasized that no one required them to change their faith. Simply, in the Russian army, as described by Kuprin in the duel, the Orthodox priests took the military oath, the Muslims mullahs, and the Jews Rafiel. In a word, they did not touch the faith of the Crimean Tatars, land property, and in addition, provided serious benefits and privileges, but many of them harbored a grudge against Russia, which deprived them of the meaning of life, raids, and the slave trade. Then, under favorable circumstances, this hatred will spill out, But more on that later.